Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the X's and O's with Greg Cosell. That gentleman over there is Greg Cosell of NFL Films and ESPN's NFL Matchup. We're in the awesome Super Bowl sweatshirt. Greg, what Super Bowl is that from?
It was in Arizona. What was the last one in Arizona?
I don't know.
A couple
Wow.
of years ago, I forget.
Yeah. Way
Yeah.
to start the podcast, Doug. Anyway, I'm Doug Farrar. I'm Doug Farrar, messing this up of Touchdown Wire on the USA Today Sports Media Group. Greg, I put out my list of the top 11 safeties in the NFL this week, and that's all subjective, but I want to talk about the safety position and how it's changed in the last few years. It's kind of our main subject. Before we get to that, I want to discuss one Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Apparently, was it on Ross Tucker's podcast that you were talking about Lawrence last week? And you apparently, according to social media, you're an idiot who does not watch tape and shouldn't be talking about football at all. So that's kind of interesting.
Apparently.
So your overall, just your opinion of Lawrence. He was supposedly the generational guy coming out of Clemson in 2021, and we all know what we think of that word. But when you look at Lawrence after year 3, and a couple of things, he was dealing with real chemistry issues with the receiver, like location, the 3 interception game against the Browns. I think 2 of those, the receivers and he were not on the same page. He had multiple injuries. He had an AC joint sprain in his right shoulder. He had a ankle injury. Before we get into your specific opinion of Lawrence, when you know there are injuries, you see communication issues, how much do you take the sort of ancillary things besides the quarterback himself? How much do you take that into account when you're evaluating?
Not a great deal. First of all, I think that if you spoke to players, which I have, as you have as well, if you're playing, you're playing. I think, and that's, I worked with Ron Jaworski for, close to 30 years. And he would always say, if you're out on the field, you have to evaluate the player the way in which he plays. Otherwise, don't play. So that's not overly relevant.
Okay.
There's a lot to talk about with Lawrence. I've studied him in detail. Obviously studied him coming out of Clemson. Within the last couple of weeks, I probably watched 250, 300 dropbacks from a year ago. Obviously, that first year in the league under Urban Meyer, that did not work out well for many different reasons that we don't need to go into.
Right.
The second year with Doug Peterson and Press Taylor, I thought that they really did a nice job of sort of tightening up his delivery, getting his base firmer, because he was a big strider. When you watched him at Clemson, one thing you saw, and don't forget that offense at Clemson by NFL standards is a very simple offense. So you really had to watch a lot of Lawrence in college to get a feel for how you thought he would play in the league. And you have to put aside how people think about him based on the generational. That stuff's irrelevant.
Right.
What you have to do when you evaluate a quarterback, and I learned this from Bill Walsh, when you evaluate a quarterback, you have to isolate the traits and attributes of the quarterback. That's how you evaluate a quarterback. Numbers can become a function of many other things. And that's why looking at numbers on a page in many statistical categories in the NFL don't tell you much at all.
Right.
So you have to isolate the traits and attributes of the quarterback. And he was always a long strider. He needed space in front of him. If he did not have space in front of him, he sped up his delivery. And because he had a little bit of an elongated motion, he would lose some ball location. So I thought Doug Peterson and Press Taylor did a really, really good job his second year in the league and tightened him up. He really looked better throwing the football. But let's keep one thing in mind. There's a difference between watching a guy just throw a ball, let's say in shorts and a T-shirt, and then watching a guy throw a ball in the cauldron of fire that's an NFL pocket. Those are two different things. And very often a guy has a big arm and looks good throwing it when he's really clean, as most quarterbacks will, by the way. But when you start getting bodies around you, and I'm not talking about when you get hit, I'm just talking about when the pocket starts to get a little squeezed, there's people around you, and you've got to deliver the football. And by NFL standards, that's not pressure, Doug. That's just playing quarterback in the NFL.
the pocket is minimized. We talked about this with Brady. You know, when he can't step up, that's a problem. When other guys can't get out of the pocket, it's a problem. Or they can't move in that boxing ring, it's a problem. So yeah, those aren't pressures, but they are what I would call compressions of the pocket, and that's
That's a
where a lot
good
of guys
word.
are in trouble.
That's a good word. So when the pocket is squeezed or compressed, very often arm strength goes down because you can't really throw with the comfort that you're used to throwing, but
Right.
it's not really pressure by NFL standards. And that's where there's a difference in Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence has a good arm, not a gun. And it's funny. It was last year I spoke to a number of coaches about Trevor Lawrence. It just came up in conversation I've had with coaches. And, then as I said, I've been watching him since college and his whole career and just watched him a couple of weeks ago. And I made the point, and I'm even going to, read what I typed in my notes because, I think, I mean, I take notes just like you do. And I said that he has a good arm, but not a power arm. And there were times when his deep balls lost a little energy on his back end.
Yes.
When he has to move in the pocket and reset his platform, his arm strength declines. And I thought that he could drive the ball with velocity at times when he's clean in the pocket, but he's not a big arm power thrower. And then I went back and that's what I saw,
Mhm.
watching him a couple of weeks ago. And then I went back and looked at conversations I had with coaches because I always take notes when I do that as well. And this is what coaches told me, coaches who both been on the staff with him and who have played against him. This is
Okay.
what coaches said. Not a velocity thrower, not a high level passer, does not have a strong arm. This is NFL coaches.
Right.
So, it's not that he doesn't have a good arm. There's a difference between a good arm and a strong arm. You know, Matthew Stafford has a really strong arm.
Yeah.
Josh Allen has a really strong arm. Trevor Lawrence is not at that level. And there's a clear decline when the pocket gets compressed or squeezed. And
Yes.
he's got to work through that. He has a tendency to play fast when he perceives and feels pressure. And he's going to have, these are things he has to work on. It doesn't mean he can't be a good quarterback. That's the way people take these things, unfortunately, Doug, is they
Yeah.
start to take it that if a player has something to work on, particularly a highly visible position like quarterback, the most visible position, people take it as if you're saying the guy can't play.
Oh, he's hopeless, and he always will be. That's what you're saying,
Yeah,
clearly.
yeah, and that's not true. These are things that the film shows and that coaches are aware of. So these are just things as he's going into his fourth year that he has to continue to work on and try to clean up to reach an even higher level of play.
My friend Mark Schofield, who used to work here and now works at SB Nation and played quarterback all the way to small college, used to say that progress is not linear with quarterbacks. You just don't know. You don't know when they're going to, and that's true with any position. Yeah.
No, no, and
Go ahead.
that's exactly right. And even it's funny. You talk about quarterbacks who've had success in the league, like a Josh Allen, and I even, as you've probably read as well, I've been reading some things with Joe Brady and Josh Allen, and Josh speaking about it, and they're working on some things that he has to clean up as well. It's an ongoing I guarantee if you were, and we're not going to have this ability to do it, but if we were talking to Tom Brady, he would tell you that every single year, even going into year 16, 17, whatever year it was, that he felt he had to improve in certain areas.
Well, I
I
got to talk to
guarantee he would say that.
Yeah, I got to talk to Josh 2 weeks ago, and he said what Joe Brady is doing. It's a lot of new stuff. It's stuff that we didn't do last year because he only had half the season as the OC. And he said it makes me want to clear up my eyes, my throwing motion, how I am in and out of the pocket. He said I have a lot to clean up because this new offense is going to demand things of me that have not been demanded of me before, and that just makes sense.
Right. So, it's always the case. It doesn't mean that you're saying the quarterback can't play. It just means that there are things to work on, to continue to get better at. And ideally that happens. I mean, now this is Trevor Lawrence's third year with the same coaching staff.
Mhm.
Um, obviously they're going to have a new receiving core. That could take some time, but that's not the way to evaluate Lawrence. That becomes a numbers thing.
Right.
People say, well, if they didn't have some drops last year, that's not relevant to Trevor Lawrence and how he plays the position of quarterback.
Right. Well, just my notes, because I was separate from what happened to you on social media. I was putting together a Lawrence film piece, and you and I talked on the phone a couple days ago to prep for this. And the things you said and the things I was the notes I was making based on my tape study were kind of the same. He struggled to throw from a firm base most of the season. He would open his shoulder too often and reduce his mechanics under pressure, leading to some wild high throws. He tries throws too often when he's in the defender's hands and the play is over. That YOLO stuff. Regarding the arm strength, decent but not great power thrower whose deep balls tend to lose velocity on the back end.
They do.
Yeah. Good on the movement in the pocket. There's some stuff to work out. Is this a regression from the 2022 season? Too hurried in the pocket, threw 8 of his 14 interceptions last season when he was clean, which is kind of disconcerting. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff to kind of sew up here before we can look at Trevor Lawrence and go, hey, he's one of those guys. I mean, he's going to get paid like it because that's the market. But, my concerns jibe a lot with yours, which,
Yeah, one thing I really liked about Lawrence, though, was he worked the one-on-one matchups outside the numbers, both to the boundary and the field versus single high safety coverage. And I think in the NFL, you have to do that. I mean, you talk to coaches and they'll say, let's say it's a 3-by-1 set and it's single high safety. You're working the boundary X receiver. I mean, it's the NFL. You have to work matchups. And he did that, and he did that well. And he made a lot of good throws like that. And those would probably be viewed as higher degree of difficulty throws. And I know that there's, metrics for that. I have to see the plays myself, just like pressure. I have to see those plays because my sense of pressure from being taught by people smarter than I over the years is probably different from maybe other sense of pressure that are put in statistical metrics. But Lawrence was willing to make difficult throws, and that is always a positive in my view in the NFL.
Well, I would say just to before we get into safeties and putting that, the safeties, that's one of the toughest positions to evaluate, especially deep third safeties, because you have to watch. You can't do highlights. You have to watch every play, and you have to know where they're deployed, and it's so different.
Oh, exactly.
I would say if you're just going on, and Pro Football Focus does a great job with their metrics, or Sports Info Solutions, or whoever. If you're not taking those metrics and going to the tape, especially with safeties, man, there would be, these numbers, and I go, well, okay, let's look at what that actually means.
Right.
If you're not doing both, I don't
That's
think
really true of anything. I mean,
Yeah.
and the thing is, because there's more and more metrics, is a lot of people now who don't study tape see metrics because they're available, and they assume that gives them a true sense of what a player is, regardless of position, and that's just not true. You've got to watch plays.
Well, like right now, I'm putting together my list of my favorite slot defenders, and I'm looking at metrics, and I'm like, okay, this guy, he was like overhang. It's not slot. It's different. It's just
right. It's totally different.
So, yeah, you have to do that all. Well, let's get to safeties, Greg. And
sure.
Something that when the Bills drafted Cole Bishop this year, we both like Cole Bishop from Utah a lot, and they're moving on from Hyde and Poyer as their kind of the glue of that defense. Brandon Beane mentioned how much they need their safeties to be interchangeable.
Yes.
And while there aren't the designations as there were before, between free and strong, like Earl Thomas was in the, the deep third 900 snaps, Cam Chancellor was in the box 900 snaps. Those designations have kind of gone away. So how much more important is it for your safeties to be interchangeable? And when we say interchangeable, what does that mean?
Well, that term came into play a number of years ago. That means that a safety can play both on the back end, ideally single high, post safety, where he's the only safety, so he's playing post safety in the middle, but also can play down low in the box or overhang. In other words, where he's essentially, I don't want to say purely a run defender, but he can add in and be part of the run defense. So he can play on the back end and he can play in the box. In an ideal world, you would like both of your safeties to be able to do that, because unless you're just ridiculously good on defense, and you mentioned the Seahawks, where they could line up on 98% of their snaps with Earl Thomas at post safety and Cam Chancellor as a box or overhang safety, and they played a ton of cover 3. Unless you have that kind of talent throughout your defense, it's hard to line up and play the same thing all the time.
Yeah, you better start mixing it up.
Yeah, you'd really like your safeties to be multi-dimensional with their traits and their attributes, so they could line up both on the back end and closer to the line of scrimmage.
With the increased use of, nickel is the new base. We all know that. A lot of teams using more dime. Spags of the Chiefs loves his dime, especially on third down. A few years ago, Greg, I first noticed, and it's one of those things that hits you, and you don't know when or how. A few years ago, when I was doing draft tape on safeties, I started to notice that safeties in the draft were playing a lot more slot. And I think that's really kicked over to today in the NFL. While the free and strong designations have changed, there do seem to be two distinct kinds of safeties today. There are the deep third guys like Antoine Winfield Jr., Jesse Bates III, Geno Stone, Kirby Joseph, Tayshaun Gibson Sr., all guys who made my list. And the guys who are now logging more than 300
Yeah,
snaps.
but if I could just interrupt you,
Yeah,
Doug, that's not necessarily true. When the 49ers played cover one, Tayshaun Gibson was their tight end matchup man to man.
right.
So I mean, that's the whole point, is that these guys are not just one position players.
No, they're
Antoine
not.
Winfield played near the line of scrimmage a lot and is an outstanding blitzer.
Yep.
So, I think that's sort of where we're going. Is I didn't, look, I know what you're trying to say, and I wasn't here to like say you're wrong, but I'm just saying that,
No,
these guys are used in multiple ways, and we still have to get into zone concepts, which are really, really important, particularly quarters. But keep going. I'm sorry
yeah.
to interrupt.
No. Well, the point is, all of those positions are more nuanced, and then you have these guys who are at 300 snaps a season at box, slot, and free. Your Kyle Hamilton, Xavier McKinney, Harrison Smith, Julian Blackman, Jabril Peppers, who really stood out for the Patriots last year.
They're playing all over the field, these guys.
Yeah. So just and I'm sure you've noticed this too. How much more? It's not just interchangeable between intermediate and deep. It's really so much more of what you have to do. You look at a guy like Brian Branch. Yeah, he played some safety. Really, he was at his best in the slot. He's termed a safety. He can play safety, but just how much more the safety position has expanded in just overall conceptually, and what that position or now positions mean to a defense. Because I think if you go back even, I don't know, 5-7 years, not even 10,
Right.
what a safety is then and now is almost completely different. The definitions and the importance of have just
Well,
changed so much.
I think there's a number of reasons for that, and we'll try to get through as many as we can realistically. Number one, I think the influx of tight ends who are essentially receivers more than inline blockers is become a really critical piece for the way the safety position has had to evolve.
Yep.
Because they have to be able, one of your safeties, ideally both, but certainly one, has to be able to match up man to man to quality receiving tight ends. Because if you're going to play man coverage, that's going to happen quite a bit, and everybody has to play man coverage somewhere along the line. So I think that's number one. I think that's pretty self-evident and self-explanatory.
Right.
Number two, which may not be as clear to some, is with the increase in quarters coverage. Okay, 4 across. Okay, and one of the reasons we've seen an increase in quarters coverage is it takes away the seams, so therefore it takes away vertical seam throws.
Mm-hmm.
Because defensive coordinators, and I'm reducing it to simplest terms, but defensive coordinators are most concerned about big explosive plays. If you want to really go hardcore Cliff Notes version, the game for the offense is let's create explosive plays, and the game for the defense is let's take away explosive plays.
You've said this 100 times in the last year on this podcast.
Right, and that's the way it is, by the way. And so therefore you play quarters, and now you have the field is balanced because you have two safeties. So the field is balanced. So now two safeties, so there's no seams. Theoretically there's a middle seam, but that's a really tight throw. That's a tough throw to make.
Yep.
So the reason that it's important now, getting back to the importance of safeties, is when offenses line up in 2x2 sets, okay? If the inside receiver, the number 2 receiver, okay, the slot receiver, for definition purposes, if he runs a vertical, the safety has to match up to him man to man. Yes. So even though quarters is a zone principle, what quarters really is is man-to-man with rules.
Yeah.
That's what quarters essentially is.
I tend to think of
So
quarters as primarily a match defense. I don't think
that's
of
what it is. That's
no,
why I said it's man-to-man with rules.
right,
So it's essentially a match defense. But
right.
the point is that your safety, if number two runs vertical, and different coaches have different markers as to where they match him man to man.
Mhm.
Some coaches say 8 yards, some coaches say 10 yards. But the point is, at some point, it becomes a match for the safety. He's got to match up man to man.
Mhm.
So now your safeties have to play with the increase in quarters coverage. You need safeties who can play some man coverage. They can't just be zone safeties where they're just
Oh no.
basically playing an area and reading route concepts. They have to be able to match up and play man coverage.
Kyle Hamilton, who in my opinion is the NFL's best safety now. I mean, he's 6'4", 220. He had a rep against Jalen Guyton of the Chargers last year, and I put it up in the piece where he matched Guyton like 30 yards downfield in press slot, which you don't expect that. So that as they say, the more you can do, the better it is. One other thing I wanted to get, unless you had more thoughts on,
No, no, let's keep talking. I don't
yeah,
want to. I don't want to give a lecture here.
right.
It's not a college seminar.
Another thing that we've seen a lot more in the last few years is coverage switches, and safeties are obviously a big part of that. It looks like single high and then it becomes two or whatever. What specific demands does that place on safe? Because obviously, if it's 1 to 2, then you're playing two or you're playing whatever the thing becomes. But there can still be a lot of communication issues when guys are moving around pre-snap and trying to get to a spot.
Well, anytime you're communicating on the back end in one form or another, I mean that goes beyond just the physical attributes and traits you're looking for in a player. That now gets into a lot of communication. But keep in mind that different teams now would get, now a thought popped into my head. I want people to understand that, you and I talk and we do a general topic, but we
Yeah.
don't really talk about specifics. Now it's just kind of talking off the cuff and things pop into my head.
Mhm.
So think about motion now. And think about a team like the Detroit Lions, okay? And they're not the only team that does this, but they just popped into my head because I saw a lot of Lions because they were good this year. So I probably saw every single game. So I saw their defense. So what teams do a lot in response to motion is they flip. So in other words, a corner, let's say a wide receiver goes in motion across the formation.
Mhm.
Okay. And first of all, you don't know if that's going to be a jet sweep or if that's true motion, which changes the strength of the offense. And
Right.
therefore it can change the strength of the defense. So there's a lot going on. But
Mhm.
the reason I brought up the Lions is they had a tendency when teams did that to take the corner who was playing the motion guy, because now that receiver's disappeared, he's going across the formation. That corner would retreat and become a safety, and the
Mhm.
safety would come down and match the motion receiver across the formation.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I've seen a few other instances of that, but
Oh,
yeah,
they're
good
not
call.
the only team
Yeah,
that
right.
does that.
Yeah,
But
it's a good
so
call.
now, if you're going to do that because of the increase in motion in the league, now you're also asking a safety who's more used to playing on the back end to either have to match man to man to a receiver crossing the formation, or even if you're not playing man, now that safety is playing zone underneath. So, it's just safeties have far more responsibilities now in the way defenses have evolved and the way defensive coaches have so many variations within basic defensive zone concepts. I mean, I remember being in New Orleans a few years ago and talking to Dennis Allen. And Dennis Allen said, we were discussing coverage, and he said, well, we have 10 versions of cover three, which
Sure.
likely means they have 10 versions of cover four also. I mean,
Or
you know how
even
that
more, I
goes.
mean, 20 versions of 4 because teams use more 4 than 3 now.
Yeah, so now the point is you're asking your safeties to have way more responsibility than, let's say, years ago, going back 15, 20 years when cover 2 was very much in vogue, or just base cover 3 was in vogue, where teams did not have 10, 12 versions of something. They basically lined up in cover 3 weak, cover 3 strong. Maybe the boundary corner would play, would press, maybe he wouldn't. I mean, now there's many, many variations where the safeties have to be involved in a number of different things and often have to match up to wide receivers.
One thing I wanted to get into before we get into a few individual players is big nickel. And I did a little homework assignment and got together 5. this is for every defense, 5 defensive backs on the field with 3 safeties.
Yep, big nickel. Yep.
The Vikings, because of Josh Metellus, are way ahead of the pack.
Well, he literally played about 97% of their snaps this year.
Yeah. So, and this is not in deployment, because I know he played kind of a linebacker role sometimes, but 3 safeties on the field where they were deployed. The Vikings had 749 snaps of big nickel. The Lions were second at 487. Then the Ravens, then the Rams.
Well, you're counting Branch as a safety, obviously.
Yes.
But he was really their slot. But
Right.
I guess there was a stretch of 3-4 games in the middle of the season where he did play safety in their base defense, and then he became their slot. But for the most part, he was the slot. I would bet the Cowboys were up there in terms of big nickel as well.
They were. So I just wanted to get into, if you have 3 safeties on the field like that, and different teams do big nickel differently, but I wanted to get into sort of, I mean, not every team does it the same, so the assignments aren't always the same, but in a general sort of league amorphous sense, if you have 3 safeties on the field like that, what are they doing, or what are they supposed to be doing?
Well, obviously teams deploy it differently, but
Sure.
in a very general sense, you're taking a linebacker off the field and putting a safety on the field, a third safety, because you want to be able to have a better athlete on the field to defend the pass. And you feel with a safety, as opposed to a true nickel corner, who tend to be smaller, that you then are still in a better position to defend the run. So in your mind, you're getting a better athlete on the field to defend the pass, but you're still in better position to defend the run than if, Mike Hilton at 5'9", 175 pounds, who's a great nickel in my view, but
Yeah, good player.
and super competitive, by the way. His name just popped into my head, but he's still 5'9", 175 pounds, So, I mean, I remember, there are teams, and you and I watch a lot of tape. There are teams that if it's 1st and 10 and they line up in 11 personnel and the defense lines up with regular nickel, meaning they have a slot corner, teams will run at the slot corner.
Sure.
Because he's smaller, I mean, so if you go big nickel, and Dan Quinn was a big purveyor of that, and we'll see what he does now with the Commanders, but he played 3 safeties a ton last year with Jaron Kearse, with Donovan Wilson, and with Malik Hooker. And Kearse is 6'4", 220.
Right.
So he could match up to tight ends, but he's also big enough essentially to defend the run.
You mentioned during the season how the Cowboys they had a couple of guys you mentioned, and I'm drawing a blank on the names, who really blurred the line between linebacker and safety.
Kearse is the number 1 guy.
Yeah. They had a couple of guys like 2.
Well, they had the other kid too, Bell, number 14.
Yes.
Yeah, Bell, number 14. Forget his first name. Marquise, maybe something.
Marquise Bell. Yeah.
Yeah, but he was a safety in college, and they made him a linebacker. And there were times he got exploited a little bit because he's not truly a linebacker.
Yeah,
which is, I believe, one reason they drafted one this year. And I'm trying to remember who the linebacker was they drafted. I don't have their draft class in front of me, but I think they drafted a stacked backer type this year with one of their picks, and not a 6th or 7th round pick. But I don't have that right in front of me.
I'm looking it up.
Pull that up.
Yeah, if you want to keep vamping there, I'll look it up.
Yeah. But anyway, the point is a lot of teams play big nickel now. I mean, Spags in KC played big nickel. A lot of teams play big nickel now, just for the reason that they allows them to better defend the pass. They just feel a lot more comfortable with a safety as opposed to a third linebacker. And I'm talking about, on early downs for sure.
Oh, Myris, you found the kid from Notre Dame they took in the 3rd round.
Yeah.
So let's get into a few of these guys. These are the top 5 on my list.
Yeah, we don't need to go through every single guy.
Yeah, I want to just get your thoughts overall on what makes these guys. And Kyle Hamilton, I mean, this is planet theory, Greg. 6'4", 220-pound guys do not move like this.
Yeah, but you're talking with a guy that is on the top end of just athletic traits. And I always hate to use the word freak because that's one of those words. But I mean, he's just a different kind of guy in terms of what he can do at that size. Because he essentially played their slot corner as the season progressed. At times they play Arthur Millette, and he actually played well for them. But as the season progressed, Hamilton essentially became their slot corner.
And he became a press slot corner, and as we've discussed, that's really tough. So for him to be able to just take on all these different roles is quite something. Antoine Winfield Jr. of the Bucks got a very large contract and earned it. He was, a lot of pass breakups, a lot of deflections. If you had the ball and Winfield was around, you might not have it for long, but just his overall skill set, because he did play a ton of deep reps, but as you said, he
He
was
can
also
blitz. He was a good blitzer. I mean, obviously Todd Bowles is one of the most creative blitzers in the league and has been for years. And Winfield was a significant part of their pressure concepts, and he was very good at it.
one guy that really stood out to me when I was doing this, and I didn't watch him a lot in season because it was the Patriots and Jabril Peppers played a lot more. I mean, people tend to think of him as kind of that Patrick Chung intermediate rover role. He played 563 snaps as a high safety, 296 in the box, 242 in the slot, and he was just sort of all over the field. Wherever he was, he would get to the ball in such a hurry. Just a supercharged player who would force bad plays kind of no matter where you put him.
Yeah, I mean, Peppers is one of those guys. He kind of played the rover position in college. People might not be aware, but the defensive coordinator at the time in Michigan, I believe, was a man named Don Brown,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
who was the defensive coordinator at Boston College prior. And you know who played the same positions in college in Don Brown's defense? They played the same college position.
Who's that?
Jabril Peppers and Matt Milano.
Aha. Interesting. I did not know that about Milano.
Yeah, so Peppers has always been a guy that has sort of multi-positional, multi-dimensional tendencies. When he came out, a lot of people saw him not as a pure safety per se, because he was very good down near the box, but he also was athletically gifted enough where people didn't feel that, he could only play in the box.
Right. Xavier McKinney, formerly of the Giants, now the Packers, and the Packers went all in on safeties. They signed McKinney to a huge deal. They selected Georgia's Javon Bullard and Oregon State's Keaton Oladapo in the draft. So they have 3 new safeties. And
yeah, McKinney's interesting because when he was at Alabama, he played the slot a lot. So
right.
He's another one of those guys that, and I don't know, I don't think they signed him to play the slot, but you never know how we're talking in June right now.
Well,
so,
I think under Jeff Hafley, you get this many safeties, you want to be able to have them do different things. And Bullard,
well, that's the point. Yeah. And they have a new coordinator in Mark Hafley, and he's been in the league. He just came from BC, but he's been in the league before. So it'll be really interesting to see what they do and how they use him. But he's another one of those multi-dimensional safeties. He can play on the back end. He can play in the box. He's played in the slot. And that's what you'd ideally like, because number one, it makes you less predictable defensively. See, that's the thing. We talked about the Seahawks with the Legion of Boom, and they were so good all across the board with literally every player on their defense that they could literally just line up and say, here we are, and you can't beat us. But those days are kind of gone. It's teams don't just line up and do one thing.
I think even if you had the LOB now, the way offenses are arrayed to confuse you, even the Seahawks of like 2013, they led the league in scoring defense 4 years in a row, which they were the only team to do it. I think the Vikings did it 69 to 73, 72.
Right.
They're the only team ever to do it 4 years post-merger, which in today's NFL is just insane.
Right.
But they still have to switch it up.
Because what offenses try to do, and I've heard coaches use this term, because I've had these conversations, is offenses often try to line up in what they call indicator formations. Mm-hmm. Formations where they feel, based on film study, that they know they know the look they're going to get. That doesn't mean they get the exact defense, but they know the look they're going to get. So they line up in, as they say, indicator formations. And that helps your quarterback and it helps your offense. Now, that doesn't, as I said, this is the chess match. This is why football is so much fun and why it's constantly evolving, and why no matter how much tape you watch, and it's very frustrating at times. I mean, all I do is basically watch tape. But it's so frustrating because as I sit and watch tape, I wish I had the bat phone to every coach in the league and could just pick up the phone and go, okay, what was your thought process here? Why did you do this? What were you thinking? Because there's just stuff that you can't know unless you're in their meetings, unless you're, in the install in the meetings. And I want to know it, but I can't know it. It's like going into the bookstore. I'm a big bookstore guy. I go to Barnes and Noble every weekend.
Same.
And it's exhilarating and frustrating because I walk in and I know there's 1,000 books I'll want to read that I'll never be able to read because there's just too many books.
Yeah. Plus, you're too busy watching tape. And you watch the Lions defense a lot. Just your thoughts on Kirby Joseph last season, because he made my list as well, and he was another guy
He
who just
predominantly played on the back end.
yeah
Once Gardner Johnson got healthy again, they started to do a little more of interchangeable to get back to our initial term.
yeah
But for the most part, he played on the back end. Like, in other words, when Melanfanu became the other safety,
mhm.
it was pretty much Melanfanu playing in the box and Joseph playing on the back end. But then when Gardner Johnson, because he's one of those true interchangeable safeties,
Oh
because he has corner skills as well, because
right
he played some corner in college.
yep.
So then Joseph began to move around a little bit more, but I would bet you may have the numbers in front of you because you just watched him recently. I would bet that 70 to 80% of Joseph's snaps came on the back end.
I have that right here. He had 833 at high safety, 111 in the box,
There
97.
you go. So it's even a higher percentage.
Yeah, and this is he intercepted 3 Aaron Rodgers passes in 2 games against the Packers in his rookie season. Is even better in 2023. So there you go.
Yeah, so I know he's one of those just solid. You wouldn't call him an impact, game changer, but he's a solid safety.
Yeah. Well, I think the overarching point here, as you said, is if you're going to play safety, you're going to play about 4 positions now,
Yes,
for the most part, and that's really it's changed. We talk a lot about how we both written books about it, how positions change and responsibilities change based on what the other side of the ball is doing. And I think it's why I wanted to discuss safety, because there's so many more new and different things safeties are tasked to do than I've
but
ever.
they're going to have to be able to do them well. Like you say, you're going to be asked to play 4 positions.
Yeah.
You know, you have to be able to do at least most of those well, because defensive coordinators will want you to match up somewhere along the line, man to man, whether it's tight ends
Mhm.
or even wide receivers. Now, obviously, it's not going to be a steady diet of pure man versus wide receivers, but you're going to have to be able to do it at some point. So it's not just a matter of being versatile, it's a matter of being able to be versatile and do them well.
A jack of all trades and master of all. Not easy to do.
No, it's very, very hard to do. I mean, someone like Jesse Bates, who's a really good player, he's predominantly a back end player,
Yep.
but he's very, very good at it. He has a tremendous feel for receiver. Well, to use one of your favorite terms, tremendous feel for receiver distribution and location and the route concepts that work off that.
Yep. He was number 5 on my safety list this year. Baited Bryce Young into 2 interceptions in his first NFL game. He was just hanging back, hanging back,
Well,
hanging.
one of them he
I know
actually
he's going
stepped
to throw it.
outside of what one of them he stepped outside of what his responsibility was because he read it and he knew.
Yep.
But he wasn't supposed to be there, but he
No,
was.
but he
Yeah.
was. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that was one of several unfortunate welcome to the NFL moments for Bryce Young. Well, Greg, you are our 5-tool guy every week, and we always appreciate the insight and knowledge and understanding. And we'll be talking more X's and O's next week.
All right, Doug. Yeah, this one was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I like it. Off season is good to just get a subject and go off. So it's fun.